Chapter 37 of John Deane of Nottingham, Historic Adventures by Land and Sea. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Betty B. John Deane of Nottingham, Historic Adventures by Land and Sea, by William Henry Giles Kingston. Pennsylvania, Return Home, Last Adventures, and Conclusion. Captain Deane and his companions had a prosperous voyage up the Delaware, and in 2 days the buildings of the new city appeared in sight, standing at the junction of the Delaware and the Schuylkill. The Delaware is a noble stream, and the Schuylkill is as broad as its mouth as the Thames is at Woolwich. The banks of the great river above which the town was laid out were bold and high, the air pure and wholesome, while the neighboring lands were free from swamps. Altogether the site was one admirably fitted for the purpose of a great city. Clay for making bricks was found on the spot, and quarries of good stone abounded within a few miles. Already the city was laid out according to the design of its sagacious founder, but as yet, although a considerable number of houses had been erected near to each other, forming streets, many were only scattered about here and there, according as the owners had purchased their town lots. 2 streets, one of them facing a magnificent row of red pines, were planned to front the rivers. The great public thoroughfare alone separated the houses from the banks. It was arranged that these streets were to be connected by the High Street, a magnificent avenue perfectly straight and 100 feet in width, to be adorned with trees and gardens. At a right angle with the High Street, a broad street of equal width was to cut the city in two from north to south. It was thus divided into 4 sections. In the exact center of the city, a large square of 10 acres was reserved for the advantage of the public, and in the middle of each quarter a smaller square of 8 acres was set apart for the same purpose. 8 streets, each 50 feet wide, were to be built parallel to the High Street, and 20 of the same width parallel to the rivers. Mr. Penn's great object was to give a rural appearance to the houses of his new city. The boat reached the shore before a large building, which from the signboard swinging in front of it, on which a large blue anchor was painted, was known to be a house of entertainment. Deane and his companions, hauling up their boat, hastened towards it, as he hoped there to obtain the information as to where Giles Dainsforth and his sister were to be found. This building was then one of the most important in the province. It was not only a beer house, but an exchange, a corn market, and a post office. It was formed of large rafters of wood, the interstices being filled with bricks, which had been brought in the vessels from England, in the same manner as houses to be found in Cheshire, and some built in the Tudor and Stuart periods. Already a magnificent quay of 300 feet in length had been formed by the side of the river, and there were also stone houses with pointed roofs and balconies and porches in different parts. Although in some portions of the city pine trees and pine stumps still remained, altogether upwards of 1,000 houses had been erected. Among them was a large building devoted to the purposes of a public school or college. A printing press had long been established in the city by William Bradford, a native of Leicester, who had accompanied Mr. Penn in the Welcome. Deane had, however, but little inclination to view the city until he had found his way to the house of his sister and brother-in-law. He had no great difficulty in discovering it, for Giles Dainsforth was already well known as a man of mark, as sagacious, steady, and industrious men are sure to be in a new settlement. "There is friend Dainsforth's house," said a worthy citizen to whom Deane addressed himself, and he saw before him a fine and substantial stone building, with a broad veranda surrounded by trees and flowering shrubs. A gentle voice reached his ears, singing an air he knew well. The door stood open, and he entered. Passing through the house, he saw seated on a lawn, beneath the shade of the building, 3 ladies, while the same number of young children played about them. The nearest he recognized as his sister Kate, though grown into more matronly proportions than when he had last seen her. Near her was a fair girl. He required not a second glance to convince him that she was Elizabeth. He hurried forward, forgetting how he might startle them. A cry of delight escaped Elizabeth as she advanced to meet him. In another minute he found himself in the arms of his sister, while a sob of joy escaped from her companion's bosom. He's come, she exclaimed. "I knew he would find us." The third lady was Mistress Pearson. She looked careworn and aged, as if her life had well nigh come to an end. Their history was soon told. When at length Captain Davis was ordered to visit the plantations previous to returning to England, he obtained permission to receive them on board and to convey them home. When the ship was cast away, with a few only of the crew had been rescued. The captain, however, although he was the last to leave the ship, had also been saved. Deane had fortunately told Elizabeth of the marriage of Giles Dainsforth to his sister, and of their intention of settling in Pennsylvania. On their arrival, therefore, at Philadelphia, hearing his name, she made herself known to him, and it was thus that she and Mistress Pearson became inmates of his house. In a short time, Giles Dainsforth himself, accompanied by Captain Davis, arrived at the house, and a happy party were soon assembled round the supper table. Deane heard a great deal of the flourishing condition of the plantation, and of its vast internal resources. He heard, too, from Dainsforth that the settlers had resolved not to allow the importation of slaves into the colony. They had established it because they themselves loved freedom, and they were resolved to employ free men alone in the cultivation of their lands. He also heard that the whole territory had been purchased from the native tribes, and that not the life of a single red man had been taken away by the settlers since their arrival in the country. From the first they had lived on the most friendly terms with the native tribes. This was indeed glorious news, especially in those days when the traffic in negroes was looked upon as lawful, and when in most instances might made right in all parts of the world. Altogether the account which Deane received of the colony was so favorable that he could not help longing to come and settle in it. He had, however, promised to bring Elizabeth back to her parents, and poor Mistress Pearson also was very anxious to lay her bones in her native land. Captain Davis likewise desired to return home on the first opportunity, that he might stand his trial for the loss of his ship, which he considered himself in honour bound to do. Deane, however, resolved not to run the risk of again being separated from Elizabeth. She having no legal guardian, he instituted himself as such, and then gave himself permission to marry her, which she, nothing loath, consented to do forthwith. The marriage was celebrated with such religious and legal ceremonies as were then considered sufficient in Philadelphia, Colonel Markham, the acting governor, being one of the witnesses. Jack and his bride, accompanied by Captain Davis and his sister, soon afterwards embarked on board a stout ship sailing for England. They arrived safely in London, whence Jack wrote to Norwich to announce his safe return. A few days were spent in the great city, that Elizabeth might recruit her strength after her voyage. During his stay there he met with an old brother officer, Captain Bertrand, who, hailing him with pleasure, told him that he was the very man he was looking out for. "I have taken service," he said, "with the permission of the British government, under the Tsar of Russia, the great Peter, for such he is indeed. You will remember his laboring as a shipwright in England not many years since, to gain a knowledge of shipbuilding. He is now constructing a large fleet, and he is anxious to secure the services of a number of active and intelligent officers like yourself. What do you say? I can promise you handsome pay and the command of a line-of-battle ship." Deane replied that he must think about it, as he had only lately married a wife and had no inclination to leave her. "Oh, you must bring her with you," was the answer. "You can establish her in the new city the Tsar is building on the Neva, and depend upon it you will have no long cruises to make. Foreign officers can be found, but he will have a difficulty in making seamen out of his serfs. Free men only are fit to become seamen, in my opinion." Captain Deane begged that his friend would give him his address, and should he determine to accept his offer, after he had visited his friends, he would communicate with him. Leaving the unhappy Mistress Pearson with her brother, Deane set forward in a coach with his bride for Norwich. He had fortunately been able to procure the balance of prize money due to him while he was in London, which amounted to a considerable sum, and he was thus, in spite of his heavy loss in the Nottingham galley, no longer crippled by want of means. Words can scarcely describe the joy with which Madame de Mertens and her husband received their long-lost daughter. Though she had grown from a young child into a woman, they immediately recognized her, while the trinket she had preserved prevented them having any doubt about the matter. After spending some time at Norwich, and receiving great kindness from the excellent Mr. Gournay and his lady, the young couple repaired to Nottingham. The loss of the Nottingham galley, however, caused Jack to be more coolly received by his friends than he had anticipated. In vain he tried to explain to them that they should find fault with the elements more than with him for the ill success of their speculation. He undertook, if it was their wish, to command another galley, and to embark all his property in the enterprise. To this, however, none of them would agree. Yet there were two of his friends who received him in a different manner to the rest, his sister Polly and his sister-in-law Alethea. Prosperity had not improved his brother Jasper, and he appeared to be more bitter than any of the family who suffered from the wreck of the galley. A reconciliation was, however, at last brought about by cousin Nat and Polly. Jack had been dining at the house of his sister and her husband, where he met Jasper, to whose house, in Fletchergate, he agreed to walk in the evening. On their way, some remarks made by Dr. Jasper irritated John Deane, as he considered them unfair and unjust, and angry words were heard by some of the passers-by, uttered by him to his brother. They reached the door together. A flight of stone steps led to it from the street. Unhappily, at this moment, the doctor repeated the expressions which had justly offended the captain, who declared that he would not allow himself to be addressed in so injurious a manner. As he spoke, he pushed impatiently past his brother, who at that moment stumbled down the steps. The doctor fell, and as Captain Deane stooped to lift him up, to his horror he found that he was dead. Rumour, with her 100 tongues, forthwith spread the report that the fire-eating captain had killed his brother. The verdict, however, of the jury who sat to decide the case was, that Dr. Jasper Deane had died by the visitation of God. Still Captain Deane was conscious of the angry feelings which had excited his bosom at the moment, and he felt that the mark of Cain was upon his forehead. He could no longer remain at home, and though those who loved him best knew of his innocence, and did their utmost to console him, he determined to leave the country. He accordingly wrote to Captain Bertrand, accepting his offer of a naval command under the Tsar of Russia, and in a short time he and Elizabeth sailed for the Baltic. He rendered great assistance in organizing the navy of that wonderful man, Peter the Great, and after serving with much credit for a few years, he returned to England. Captain Deane had, during this time, found a number of friends, and by their means he was soon afterwards appointed English consul at Ostend, where he lived with his wife Elizabeth till they were both advanced in life. As an elderly couple they came back to Nottingham once more, and went to live in the sweet village of Wilford, on the opposite side of the silvery Trent. It was the peaceful green retreat that had beckoned him back to England from many a scene of foreign grandeur, and smiled across many a time of tumult and of battle. He and his wife both loved the Dutch home where they had so long lived, and when he built a house for himself in a thorough English village, he constructed it in the Dutch style, which indeed in his early youth had been the very height of fashion. Next to his own, behind the same trim garden and row of silvery poplars, he built one also for his sister Polly, who was then a widow. Alethea, after the death of her husband, had returned to Harwood Grange with her children, and devoted herself to them, endeavouring so to bring them up that they might love and serve God. She by this time had also gone to her rest, so also had most of those who have been mentioned in the previous history. Mistress Pearson did not live long after her return to England, and she was saved the misery of hearing the tragical death of her husband, who, with all his faults, had at all events loved her. In a desperate action with the Queen's ship, he, with all his crew, had been blown up, shortly after Deane had encountered him at the mouth of the Delaware. The tomb of John Deane, Captain R.N., and of Elizabeth his wife, is to be seen on a little green promontory above the sparkling Trent, and near the chancel of the parish church, where sweet strains of music, accompanying the sound of human voices and the murmurs of the river, are wont to mingle in harmonious hymns of prayer and praise. A more fitting spot in which to await in readiness for the last hour of life than Wilford can scarcely be imagined, nor a sweeter place than its churchyard in which the mortal may lie down to rest from toil till summoned by the last trump to rise and put on immortality. End of chapter 37.